Welcome back to Dirty Laundry, the place where we do not just air the secrets, we deep clean them. Everyone has a little something they want to hide, a stain they cannot quite wash out. But here we totally embrace the mess. We dive into the most scandalous stories, hidden truths, and ultimate unfiltered drama. Grab your popcorn, sit back, and get ready. Because today our cycle is about to spin out of control. Do not forget to hit that subscribe button before we uncover what is really in the basket. For 3 years, my grandson's wife believed she was managing an elderly inconvenience, a retired man who lived quietly in Savannah, drove a 15-year-old car, and could be dismissed in public at the right moment without consequence. She had done her research thoroughly. She knew about the modest apartment, the social security income, the second-hand furniture. She had documented everything she believed she needed to know about me. What she had not found was the entity that held the Series A veto provision on her husband's company, funded entirely by the man she had just told to wait in the lobby. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was the recording. 6 months of private conversations between her and her father, discussing 2 ways their plan could succeed. One involved removing me through a legal restructuring. The other involved waiting for me to die. She called it a natural resolution. I am 77 years old. I raised that boy from the age of 7. I sold my retirement home to fund his company without ever telling him. And I had been preparing for that exact conversation for 8 months before those words were ever spoken. By the time the recording was made, neither option was available to her anymore. Stay with me until the end. My name is James Hargrove. Most people call me Jim. She had documented everything she believed she needed to know about me. What follows is what she missed. The evening started the way most things in my life do, quietly and without ceremony. I pressed the charcoal suit I had bought at a department store sale 3 weeks earlier, the only dress suit I had purchased since my wife Carol passed. I polished my shoes with the same cloth the Army had trained me to use, because the condition of a man's shoes says something about the condition of his mind. Before I left the house, I opened the small cedar box on my dresser and took out my bronze star medal. I pinned it carefully to my left lapel. I had not worn it in years, but that night felt like the kind of night that asks something of a man, and I intended to show up to it properly. The drive from Savannah to Atlanta is nearly 4 hours on Interstate 75. I left early and arrived at the Four Seasons on 14th Street at 6:45 in the evening, 15 minutes before the doors officially opened. The building was everything Ethan's life had become: tall, polished, and built to impress. A valet I didn't recognize took my keys without making eye contact, and I walked toward the entrance with my shoulders straight and my hands steady at my sides. The way I had walked into every room for 50 years. Inside the lobby, a young man in a fitted black suit was stationed at the ballroom entrance, holding a tablet and checking names against a list. He looked at me the way people sometimes look at something that doesn't quite fit a space, a quick visual assessment, a barely visible pause, and then a careful rearrangement of his expression into something professionally neutral. "Invitation, sir?" he asked. I handed him the stiff card with gold lettering that had arrived in the mail 2 weeks prior. He scrolled through his list, found my name somewhere near the bottom, and looked up. "You're at table 14, he said. "Toward the back, near the kitchen entrance." I thanked him and walked into the room. The ballroom was everything Madison had designed it, to be: white linens on every table, tall floral centerpieces with flowers I didn't know the name of, and the kind of warm amber lighting that makes everyone inside look successful and important. 200 guests moved through the space in expensive clothes, their voices low and confident, the particular sound of people who were entirely comfortable in rooms like this one. I moved through them slowly, nodding to faces I didn't recognize, making my way toward the back. Table 14 sat exactly where the young man had said, positioned between the kitchen service doors on the left and the emergency exit on the right. 2 older women I didn't know were already seated, speaking quietly to each other. They nodded when I sat down. I nodded back. I straightened the silverware in front of me, even though it didn't need straightening. From where I sat, I had a clear and unobstructed view of the entire room. That is one thing the back wall gives you that the front tables never do. You can see everything without anyone watching you see it. And what I saw from table 14 was my grandson Ethan, standing near the center of the room, completely in his element. He was wearing a perfectly fitted navy suit. His hair was neat, his posture relaxed, and his smile was the easy, practiced smile of a man who had learned how to fill a room. He was shaking hands and laughing and leaning in to hear people speak, doing all of it with a fluency that takes years to develop. I watched him from across those 40 feet of white linen and polished floors, and despite everything, despite all the things I already knew and all the things I was prepared to do, what I felt in that moment was pride. Clear and uncomplicated. That was Thomas's son standing up there. Whatever was coming, nothing was going to change that. Then Ethan's eyes found mine across the room. It lasted less than 2 seconds. I watched the exact moment he registered my face, a small break in the rhythm of his smile, a slight stiffening along his jaw. Then he turned his head toward the man beside him, said something I couldn't hear, and kept moving. Just like that. I was gone. Not in any way that anyone else in the room would have noticed. But I noticed. The way a man always notices the moment someone he loves decides he isn't worth the trouble of acknowledgement. I pressed my thumb along the edge of the bronze star on my lapel and held it there. I had driven 3 hours and 50 minutes to watch my grandson look away from me. Across the room, a woman in a fitted white dress stepped onto the low stage near the windows and reached for the microphone. Madison. Her posture was flawless, her expression warm and composed, and I recognized immediately the look of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times before ever performing it. The room began to quiet around her. I folded my hands on the table, sat up straight, and waited. She began the way a skilled prosecutor begins, with the conclusion already decided and the evidence arranged to make the verdict feel inevitable. Ethan Hargrove, Madison said into the microphone, her voice warm and practiced, carrying easily across the quiet room, is the definition of a self-made man. I sat at table 14 and listened. He grew up without advantages, without connections, without a family name that opened doors or a financial foundation that softened the hard years. She paused for exactly the right amount of time. The way someone pauses when they have rehearsed the pause as carefully as the words. What Ethan had was something rarer. He had the will to become more than his circumstances, and the courage to cut ties with anything that held him back. Anything that held him back. I understood then that the speech had been written for 2 audiences, the 200 people seated in the room, and the one man at table 14 who was meant to hear each phrase as the personal verdict it was intended to be. Madison continued, talking about Ethan's early years at Georgia Tech, about his clarity of vision and his willingness to outwork everyone around him, about the founding of Nexus Dynamics in a shared workspace with 2 employees, and a borrowed laptop. She talked about Atlanta and its spirit of reinvention. She thanked the investors, the advisory board, the full team. She thanked her father, Douglas Keller, for his wisdom and ongoing support. She thanked people I had never heard of for contributions I didn't fully understand. She did not mention me. Ethan stood beside her through all of it, composed and smiling, looking exactly like the man she was describing, someone who had assembled himself entirely from his own materials. I watched him the way I had watched him for years, looking for the boy I had raised underneath the man he had become. He was still in there. I could see traces of Thomas in the line of his jaw, in the way he stood with his weight slightly forward, the way Thomas had always stood. But he didn't look at me. Not once during the entire speech did his eyes travel to table 14. Madison was perhaps 4 minutes into her remarks when I began to stand. I did it slowly, not because I was making a show of it, but because my left knee has given me trouble since a training accident in 1989, and fast movements remind me of that fact. I rose from my chair the way a man rises who has been sitting for a while, straightening himself 1 degree at a time. I reached up and adjusted the bronze star on my lapel, making sure it sat level. I suppose someone must have noticed, because Madison noticed. She did not miss a beat. Her voice carried on smoothly, finishing the sentence she was in the middle of, and then she turned her eyes briefly toward the back of the room and smiled with the particular warmth of a person who has anticipated every variable in a situation and accounted for each one. "Oh, and I see that Jim is here with us tonight." Her tone was gentle, the kind of gentle that a person uses when they want to appear charitable while delivering a message that is anything but. "Ethan's grandfather, Jim. It might be more comfortable for you to wait in the lobby. These industry conversations can get quite technical, and we want to make sure everyone is at ease." 200 heads turned toward table 14. I have stood in the path of incoming fire. I have delivered death notifications to families who did not yet know why their sons were not coming home. I have buried a wife and a son in the same decade and stood dry-eyed at both funerals because those people needed me to be steady, and I gave them what they needed. I am not unfamiliar with having something painful directed at me in a public setting. What I felt in that moment was not embarrassment. It was clarity. The kind that arrives when something you have suspected for a long time is finally confirmed out loud, in front of witnesses, by the person who meant it all along. I looked at Ethan. He was staring at the floor. I finished buttoning the front of my jacket, 1 button at a time. I picked up the linen napkin from my lap, folded it carefully, and set it beside my water glass. Then I pushed back my chair, stepped clear of the table, and walked toward the stage. Not quickly, not angrily. I did not hurry, and I did not slow down. The way I walk when I know exactly where I am going and have already decided what I will do when I get there. A few people near the aisle stepped aside without being asked. The room had gone very quiet. I could feel 200 people tracking my movement, the way a crowd tracks something unexpected. Madison watched me approach with an expression that was still composed, but had developed a careful stillness around the eyes, the stillness of a person running rapid calculations. I stopped a few feet in front of the stage and looked up at her. I said it loud enough for the nearest tables to hear clearly. 6 words. Nothing more. Check who the silent partner is. The stillness in her eyes became something else entirely. I watched the color leave her face the way light leaves a room when someone turns off the lamp quickly, completely, and with a finality that tells you it is not coming back on its own. Ethan looked up from the floor. I turned and walked toward the exit. I did not look back at the stage. I did not look back at table 14. I did not look back at the 200 people who had just watched a 76-year-old man in a charcoal suit and a bronze star say 6 words that made the woman at the microphone go pale in front of her entire professional network. The lobby was cool and quiet. A uniformed attendant held the door open without knowing why. I nodded to him and stepped out into the Atlanta night. And for the first time since I had walked in, I breathed without holding anything back. I sat in the parking lot of the Four Seasons for 31 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. Not because I was upset. I want to be clear about that. I was not sitting there crying into my steering wheel or rehearsing the things I should have said. I was sitting there because 31 years in the military had trained me to assess a situation fully before moving through it. And the situation I was assessing was the particular feeling of a man who has finally been proven right about something he very much wished he had been wrong about. It takes a moment to process that, even when you have spent months preparing for it. My phone rang 9 times while I sat there. Ethan called twice, then Madison once, then 2 numbers I didn't recognize, then Ethan again twice more, and then Madison a second time. I watched each call arrive and pass without touching the screen. When the 10th call began, I turned the phone off entirely, placed it in the glove compartment, and pulled out of the parking lot onto 14th Street. The drive from Atlanta to Savannah on Interstate 75 takes the better part of 4 hours when traffic is light. That night, just after 9 in the evening, traffic was light. I set the cruise control, left the radio off, and let my mind do what it had been doing quietly for most of the evening, going back a long way. I was 22 years old the first time I flew into a combat zone. Vietnam. The summer of 1971. A forward operating base outside Da Nang that smelled like red clay and diesel fuel, and something else I still cannot name precisely, but would recognize immediately if I encountered it again. I came home 14 months later with a bronze star, a piece of shrapnel lodged near my left shoulder blade, where the surgeons had decided the risk of removal outweighed the risk of leaving it, and a particular understanding of how quickly everything that matters to a person can be taken away without warning or apology. That understanding has never left me. It has shaped every decision I have made in the 50 years since. Carol was waiting at the airport when I landed. We had been writing letters for 11 months, the old-fashioned kind, paper and ink and envelopes that took a week each way. I had not told her everything in those letters, because there are things you do not put in a letter to someone you love when you are not entirely certain you are coming home. But she knew enough. And when I walked through the gate and she looked at me the way no one had since the morning I shipped out, like I was still whole, still worth something. Still the man she had agreed to love before the war had the opportunity to work on me. I married her 6 months later in the base chapel at Fort Benning, Georgia. It remains the best decision of my life, without qualification. Thomas was born 3 years after that, in a Savannah hospital on a cold Tuesday morning in February. I held him for the first time in a room that smelled like antiseptic and floor wax, and I remember thinking that this was the real work. Not the wars, not the campaigns, not the medals. This small, furious, red-faced person who needed me to be worth something and would spend the next several decades finding out whether I was. We built a life in Savannah, Carol and Thomas and I, in a house near the marsh with a yard that demanded more attention than it deserved. Thomas grew up steadily and well. He had Carol's patience and my stubbornness, which is a combination that serves a person reliably in most situations. He became a man I was genuinely proud of, which is not something every father can say without reservation. He met a good woman named Ellen. They bought a house 2 streets over from ours. They had a son they named Ethan. Then Carol got sick. Breast cancer, the kind that moves fast and doesn't respond to negotiation. She was 56 when the doctors found it, and 58 when it was finished. I sat with her through every treatment, every hospital stay, every night that started bad, and every morning that was briefly better. When it was over, I drove home alone and sat in the kitchen for 3 hours without turning on a single light. I was still learning to live inside that silence when Thomas died. A wet night on Interstate 95. A commercial truck that drifted across the center line, and 2 seconds that undid everything I had spent 30 years building carefully. Thomas was 33, Ellen was 31, Ethan was 7 years old. I drove to the cemetery for the second time in 13 months and stood in the rain in front of another hole in the ground that had no business existing. A 7-year-old boy stood beside me in a suit that was too large for him, the jacket sleeves hanging past his wrists, the collar loose around his neck, the trouser legs bunched at his shoes. Someone had dressed him as carefully as the circumstances permitted, which was not carefully enough. He held my hand without being asked, the way small children hold the hands of large adults when the world has become something they do not yet have the words to describe. After a while, he looked up at me. "Grandpa," he said, "when is Daddy coming back?" I looked at this boy, this small, bewildered, solemn boy in his oversized suit, with Thomas's jaw and Carol's eyes, and felt something move inside me that I have never been able to name precisely. It was not grief, though grief was present. It was something older and quieter, something that felt less like an ending and more like a clear directive issued from somewhere I didn't fully understand. I took his hand more firmly in mine and walked him away from the grave. I had a boy to raise. Nobody tells you how to raise a 7-year-old boy when you are 60 years old. The Army had prepared me for a great many things: sustained hardship, limited resources, making clear decisions under conditions that argued against clarity, but it had not covered the specific challenge of a child who refused to eat anything that came from a can, who had nightmares 3 or 4 nights a week and appeared at my bedroom door without knocking, and who asked questions I didn't know how to answer about what happened to people after they died. I figured it out the same way I had figured out everything else in my life, one day at a time, with whatever was at hand. I learned to cook because Ethan hated the frozen dinners I'd been surviving on since Carol passed. I bought a cookbook at the used bookstore on Bull Street and worked through it methodically, the way I had once worked through field manuals. I burned things regularly in the early weeks. Ethan ate them without complaint, which told me more about the boy's character than almost anything that came afterward. By the end of the first year, I could make a decent pot roast, a passable chicken soup, and a cornbread that he specifically requested on cold mornings before school. When the nightmares came, I didn't try to explain them away or tell him everything was fine, because he was 7 years old and smart enough to know that everything was not fine. I sat on the edge of his bed in the dark and talked to him about ordinary things: the yard, the weather, a bird I'd seen that morning near the back fence. Not because the topics mattered, but because the sound of a calm voice in a dark room is its own kind of reassurance. Eventually, he would go back to sleep. Eventually, the nightmares became less frequent. We never discussed them directly. Not once. Some things between men are handled that way. He went through phases the way children do: a period of intense interest in dinosaurs, then in astronomy, then in how computers worked. I learned something about each subject so I could follow the conversations, which were often one-sided and delivered at considerable speed. I sat in the front row at every school play, every awards ceremony, every winter concert, even after my knees began making their opinions about folding chairs clearly known. It seemed important to be visible, to be the face he looked for when he walked across whatever small stage happened to be in front of him that particular evening. His grades were good, and his teachers described him consistently as focused and self-directed. One middle school teacher wrote in a report card that Ethan had an unusual capacity for patience in difficult situations. And I had to set that report card face down on the kitchen counter and walk outside for a few minutes before I could continue reading it. He was accepted to Georgia Tech on a partial academic scholarship. I made up the difference without discussion because there was nothing to discuss. When he moved into the dormitory in Atlanta, I drove him up in my truck with everything he owned loaded in the bed. We talked a fair amount on the way up. On the drive home alone, I didn't turn the radio on. I visited him every month for 4 years. I left Savannah early on Saturday mornings and made the nearly 4-hour drive to Atlanta, brought groceries and a cash envelope that he accepted without making an issue of it, and drove back the same day. I never stayed overnight. I told myself I didn't want to crowd him. The fuller truth was that I didn't want him to feel responsible for managing my loneliness, because he was in college and supposed to be building something of his own. And that was exactly the point of everything. He graduated on a Saturday in May, standing in a row of young people in caps and gowns in the afternoon sun. When they called his name and he walked across the stage, I was in the stands with a program I had been folding and unfolding for 20 minutes. I did not embarrass myself. It required more effort than the Bronze Star had. When he told me he wanted to start a company, I asked him one question. How much do you need? He said $1,200,000. I did not react visibly, which was the correct response. I told him I'd look into it and changed the subject. That evening I called James Morrison, my attorney in Savannah, who had handled my affairs since Carol died and who was one of approximately 4 people on earth whose judgment I trusted without reservation. What I needed was a way to put my money into my grandson's company without him knowing it was me. Morrison asked why. I told him I wanted Ethan to build without the weight of knowing his grandfather's retirement was attached to every decision he made. I didn't want him choosing the cautious option because he was protecting my investment. I wanted him free to fail or succeed entirely on his own judgment. And that freedom would be harder to preserve if he understood whose money was behind him. I sold the property I had been holding near the coast. A small house I had bought with the intention of living closer to the water when I was older and had less reason to stay in any one place. I withdrew the bulk of my accumulated savings. Morrison established a limited liability company under the name Hargrove Legacy Fund and structured the contribution as a Series A investment with a silent partner provision granting me veto rights over major financial transactions. I signed the paperwork alone in Morrison's office on a Tuesday afternoon in October. His assistant brought coffee. We talked briefly about the weather outside, which was cooperating. Then I drove home to Savannah, made a sandwich, and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of the house where Ethan had grown up from 7 years old to the man he had become. I did not tell him. I thought someday I would find the right moment and explain it properly. I was wrong about the someday. I have met dangerous people. That is not a boast, just a fact of the life I chose. I have sat across tables from men who would have killed me without ceremony if the outcome had required it. I have commanded soldiers whose idea of restraint was a different caliber of weapon. In my experience, dangerous people announce themselves early if you know what to look for: a particular quality of stillness, a way of watching that gives nothing back. I missed it with Madison Keller. That is on me entirely. Ethan called on a Thursday evening in late spring, 3 years before the night at the Four Seasons. His voice carried the specific energy of a man who wants to tell you something, but isn't quite sure how you will receive it. He had met someone. He said, her name was Madison. He thought I should meet her. We had dinner 2 weeks later at an Italian restaurant in Buckhead that I had never heard of and would never have found on my own. The kind of place that does not put prices on the menu because the people who eat there are not interested in that kind of information. I wore the suit I had bought for Carol's funeral, which was the only dress suit I owned. I polished my shoes, arrived 10 minutes early, and asked for the table Ethan had reserved. Madison arrived with Ethan at exactly the stated time, which told me one thing about her before she had said a word. She was wearing something simple and expensive and perfectly chosen for the setting. She shook my hand with a firm grip and looked directly at me and smiled. And the smile was warm and genuine and lasted exactly the right amount of time. Dinner was pleasant in the way that first meetings between people who do not know each other are pleasant when everyone is making a careful effort. Ethan talked about the company. Madison asked thoughtful questions about my military service and listened to the answers with the focused attention of someone storing information rather than simply being polite. I answered her questions and asked some of my own and watched her the way I always watch people in the early minutes of knowing them, looking for the distance between what they show and what they are. I did not find anything conclusive. That was the problem. Ethan stepped outside to pull the car around when dinner ended, and Madison and I were briefly alone at the table. She set down her wine glass, leaned slightly forward, and looked at me with an expression that had changed in some small but definite way, less warm, more direct. "Jim," she said, "I want to be honest with you, because I think you're someone who appreciates that." She spoke quietly, without hurry. Ethan is at a critical point in building his professional reputation. The people he associates with publicly, including family, create impressions that are very difficult to correct once they form. I'm sure you understand what I mean. I understood what she meant. I had understood from the first sentence. I'm not suggesting anything that would affect your relationship with him privately. She continued. I'm only asking that you be thoughtful about occasions that involve his professional contacts. For his sake. Ethan came back inside before I had a chance to respond. Madison's expression returned to warm before he reached the table, as seamlessly as a lamp being adjusted. We said our goodbyes in the parking lot, and I drove home to Savannah alone. And I thought about that shift in her expression for most of the 4 hours it took me to get there. Over the months that followed, things changed gradually, in the way that gradual changes work imperceptibly at first. Then all at once, when you finally stop to measure the distance, Ethan stopped calling on Sunday evenings, which had been our routine since his Georgia Tech years. When I called first, he was generally in a meeting, or about to be, or just finishing one. He called back when he could, which became less often. The conversations grew shorter. The details grew thinner. I told myself it was the natural pattern of a son building his own life. I repeated that to myself with conviction, because the alternative was something I preferred not to examine directly. The breaking point came at Thanksgiving. Ethan and Madison had moved into a house in Buckhead, a large place that Madison had selected and furnished with a precision that left nothing to chance. They were hosting Thanksgiving for what Ethan described as a small gathering. I drove 4 hours from Savannah the morning of the holiday and arrived just after noon. The small gathering was approximately 30 people. Madison's parents, her 2 brothers and their families, several people I didn't recognize who turned out to be colleagues of Ethan's or associates of Douglas Keller. A caterer was working in the kitchen. The dining room table seated 14 and was already laid out with name cards. A young woman assisting with the event found my name on a secondary list and directed me to a smaller table near the kitchen entrance, where 3 others were already seated, a great-aunt of Madison's, who spoke very little English, an older gentleman I was never introduced to, and one of the catering staff who sat down briefly before realizing he was at the wrong table. I ate turkey and green beans and a dinner roll and listened to the sound of laughter drifting through from the dining room, where Ethan was sitting at the main table with people his wife had decided were worth the good china. I could hear his voice occasionally, clear and easy, the way it always sounded when he was in a room that felt like his. I drove home in the dark after dinner. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for a while before going inside. That was the night I should have made the call. I waited 3 more months. It cost me. The call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in October while I was fixing the back porch step. The third board from the top had been soft for 2 months. The kind of soft that announces itself as a warning before it becomes a problem. I had been meaning to replace it and kept finding other things to do first, which is how most preventable problems in life begin. That morning I finally got around to it, pulled the old board, measured the replacement, set up my tools in the thin autumn sun. It was the kind of work that requires just enough concentration to be satisfying without requiring enough to be taxing. My phone was on the railing beside me. The number that called was one I didn't recognize. A Georgia area code, Atlanta prefix, nothing I had stored. I answered the way I always answer unfamiliar numbers with my last name and nothing else. There was a brief pause, the kind that happens when a dialing system connects a half-second after the person on the other end expects. Then a man's voice, brisk and professional, clearly in the middle of a conversation he had already begun in his head. Ethan, I've been trying to reach you since Friday. We need to finalize the language on the restructuring proposal before Thursday's filing. Specifically, the section covering the Series A modification, the clause removing the silent partner veto provision. We have the language drafted, but Hendricks wants your sign-off before we submit. I did not speak. The man continued for another few sentences about filing deadlines and a meeting window and a name I didn't recognize. I stood on my back porch with a hammer in my hand and listened to every word with the particular attention of someone who has just heard something that explains a great many things about the past several months. Then the man's voice shifted. Ethan, are you there? I said nothing. Hello. A pause. Then, with the specific irritation of a person who has realized he has been talking to silence. I'm sorry. I think I may have dialed incorrectly. My apologies. The line went dead. I set the phone on the railing and looked out at the yard without moving. The live oak near the back fence had begun dropping its leaves, which it did every October with the unhurried certainty of something that has performed the same task for 100 years. A mockingbird was cycling through its repertoire in the upper branches, cardinal, wren, jay, back to cardinal. The morning had not changed. The yard had not changed. Only what I understood about my situation had changed. And that turned out to be enough. Silent partner veto provision. I was the silent partner. I had been the silent partner since the afternoon I signed the Hargrove Legacy Fund documents in Morrison's office 3 years ago. Morrison had insisted on the veto provision as a standard protective measure, and I had agreed without giving much thought to what it would mean for anyone who later wanted to move the company in a direction I hadn't approved. What it meant, I now understood with considerable clarity, was that I was an obstacle, and someone had already drafted the legal language to remove me. I picked up the phone and called the number I had for the woman at the end of my street. "Margaret," I said when she answered. "Are you home? I need to talk." Margaret Holt had been my neighbor for 6 years, and in that time, our relationship had consisted mostly of brief exchanges at the mailbox and occasional acknowledgments from our respective driveways. 2 Christmases ago, she left a plate of shortbread cookies on my porch, with a card that said only Margaret, which I had found either admirably efficient or mildly mysterious, and never fully resolved. She was 67 years old, white-haired, and carried herself with the unhurried precision of someone accustomed to being the most prepared person in any room. She grew tall sunflowers along her front fence every summer, the kind that turned slowly to follow the light throughout the day. I had never thought to ask her what she had done before she retired. She met me at her front door wearing reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and holding a pen, which told me she had been in the middle of something. She looked at my face, then at the hammer I was still carrying, then back at my face. "Come in," she said. "I'll make coffee." Her living room was book-lined and orderly, the kind of space that reflects how a person thinks rather than how they decorate. I sat in an armchair and told her about the phone call exactly what the man had said, word for word, the way I had been trained to retain and relay information accurately. Margaret listened from the sofa without interrupting once, which is considerably rarer than most people realize. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "How much do you know about your grandson's wife before she met him?" she asked. "Not enough," I said. She nodded slowly, the way a person nods when something confirms rather than surprises. "I spent 25 years on the federal bench," she said. "Civil cases, fraud, asset manipulation, contested inheritance. The specific structure you're describing, a silent partner holding a veto right. A restructuring proposal designed to quietly remove that provision. I have seen that exact construction in federal court. Twice." She paused. "Both times. The silent partner lost everything before they understood what was happening to them." I sat with that for a moment. "You haven't just been sidelined from family dinners," she said, with the flat clarity of someone stating an operational fact rather than offering comfort. "You've been identified as a financial obstacle, and someone has been working on the problem for some time." She stood and walked to her desk in the corner, opened a drawer, and removed a notepad and a pen. "We need to find out what Madison Keller did before she met your grandson," she said. "And we need to start today." It took Margaret's contact at the Georgia Bar Association 4 days to find the first one. Margaret had connections I hadn't known about and didn't ask the provenance of. She made phone calls in the mornings while I sat at her kitchen table with coffee. And in the evenings, she came back with information the way a surgeon comes back from a procedure, calm, precise, carrying things that needed to be handled carefully. On the 5th day, she set a printed document on the table in front of me and sat down across without speaking. The document was a civil court filing from Davidson County, Tennessee. The complainant's name was Paul Garrett. The date was 4 years before Ethan had ever heard the name Madison Keller. Paul Garrett had been 44 years old when the case was filed. A commercial real estate developer in Nashville, moderately successful, the kind of man who had built something solid through 20 years of consistent and unglamorous work. He had met a woman through a mutual professional contact at an industry event. They had dated for 8 months. During that time, the woman had helped him restructure the ownership terms of his primary investment vehicle, a holding company that included a silent partner provision similar in structure to the one Morrison had written into the Hargrove Legacy Fund. The restructuring had transferred effective control of the company's major assets to an entity that the woman's family office controlled. When Garrett discovered what had happened, the woman was already gone. The relationship had ended at exactly the moment when her continued presence was no longer necessary. Garrett had filed the civil case and lost. The documentation showed that every transaction had been technically authorized, technically legal, technically his own decision. That is the particular design of this kind of scheme by the time the target understands what has happened. The paper trail has been arranged to make the target appear to have been the architect of his own undoing. I studied the photograph included in the filing. Paul Garrett looked like a man who had stopped trusting the principles he had once taken for granted. He was not a foolish person. He was not a careless person. He had simply been standing in the path of something that had been moving in his direction long before he became aware of it. Margaret set a second document beside the first. There was one before Nashville, she said. A property transaction in Charleston. Different structure, same result. I looked at the two documents for a moment. She has done this before, I said. At least twice that we can document. Margaret said, possibly more. We sat with that for a while. Outside, the last of the evening light was leaving the garden, and the sunflowers along the fence had turned toward the final strip of sky. I had not touched my coffee in some time. It was 3 evenings later when Margaret found the messages. Her contact, she referred to him only as someone who owed her a professional courtesy, had obtained a record of communications between Madison and a contact stored in her phone under the initials D.K. We were reasonably certain those initials belonged to Douglas Keller, Madison's father. The messages covered a period beginning approximately 7 months before Madison had been introduced to Ethan at a professional conference in Atlanta. Margaret read them in order, in her even courtroom voice, the same voice she had presumably used on the bench for 25 years. The first relevant message, sent from Madison to D.K. approximately 6 months before she met Ethan, read as follows. Target identified. Background research complete. Proceeding to introduction phase. I set down my coffee cup. The messages continued in the same clipped, operational language brief progress reports, timeline adjustments, references to the Series A structure, and the anonymous investor holding the veto provision. Madison referred to that investor only as the legacy position, which I had to read twice before the full meaning settled. Then, in a message sent the week after Madison and Ethan's engagement was announced, Phase 1 complete. Estimated 18 months to Series B restructuring. Then we exit. 18 months. She had written an exit date before she had agreed to marry him. I asked Margaret to stop reading. She set the papers down and waited. That is one of the things I have come to understand about Margaret Holt. She knows when a person needs a moment to process something and does not try to fill that moment with sound. It is a discipline that takes more restraint than most people realize. The last message Margaret read was the one that stayed with me longest. It had been sent 4 months into the engagement, in response to something Douglas had written that we didn't have access to. Madison's reply was 6 words. The subject is emotionally dependent and highly manageable. The subject, Ethan. The boy I had carried on my shoulders through the Savannah Botanical Garden when he was 8 years old. The boy who had called me every Sunday from his Georgia Tech dormitory to tell me about his week in the particular rushing way that young people talk when they have more to say than time to say it. The boy in the oversized suit at his father's grave who had asked me when Daddy was coming back. The subject. I stood and walked out through Margaret's back door into the garden. The evening air was cool and carried the smell of turned earth and the specific dampness of a yard that has been carefully tended for a long time. I stood among the sunflowers, which in September were tall enough to reach my shoulder, and looked up at a sky that had gone completely dark. I stayed out there for a while. Margaret did not come to find me. She understood, I think, that some things need to be stood with quietly before a man is ready to decide what to do about them, and that the standing is part of the deciding. You cannot choose clearly what comes next until you have fully absorbed what the last thing cost you. I went back inside eventually. Margaret had left a fresh cup of tea on the counter near the back door without comment, which I drank standing at the kitchen window looking out at the darkened garden. Then I sat down at her table and told her I was ready to continue. She didn't ask what I had been doing outside. She simply set the remaining documents between us and picked up where she had stopped. We worked for another 2 hours that night, going through everything methodically: the communications history, the financial records, the corporate filings associated with the restructuring proposal. The picture that emerged was thorough and cold and without gaps. Madison Keller had not walked into Ethan's life by accident. She had researched him, identified the Hargrove Legacy Fund through a banking contact her father maintained, determined that the silent partner provision needed to be removed before a successful Series B could proceed, and built an 18-month plan to accomplish exactly that. The marriage was not a relationship. It was a mechanism built for a specific financial purpose, with a scheduled end date and a man at its center who had been assessed, in writing, as emotionally dependent and highly manageable. I drove home just after midnight. I made a sandwich I didn't finish and sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a while before going to bed. The sleep I got was shallow and watchful, the kind where the body rests and the rest of you keeps working. It was during the quiet days that followed, while I was sorting through everything I had learned, that a memory surfaced, something I had filed away without fully understanding at the time, because I hadn't yet had the context to make sense of it. 3 months before the Four Seasons event, Ethan had come to Savannah. He hadn't called ahead. I was on the back porch with coffee when I heard the front gate, and I came around the side of the house to find him walking up the path. He was wearing a jacket too light for the October morning, and had the slightly unfocused look of a man who had been driving a long time with too much on his mind. He sat down on the porch, and I made a second pot of coffee, and we talked for close to an hour about the company, about a new contract, about the yard and the weather and a dozen ordinary things. He talked the way people talk when they are working towards something they haven't yet decided how to say. After about 40 minutes, he stood up to leave. He had driven 4 hours from Atlanta and was staying less than 1. I noted that and chose not to examine it too directly. He put on his jacket and walked to the porch steps. Then he stopped with his back to me. "Jim," he said, "if things ever get complicated, the paperwork you signed still matters. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." He did not turn around. He did not explain it. He walked to his car and left, and I stood on the porch watching his taillights disappear around the corner and told myself he was under stress, talking about something from work, that the long drive hadn't been about anything specific. I had told myself that because the alternative that my grandson had come 4 hours to deliver a warning he didn't have the courage to deliver plainly was something I preferred not to look at directly. Looking at it now, in the full light of what I had learned, I understood exactly what it was. He had known, not for weeks, for months. He had come to Savannah on a Tuesday morning to tell me in the only way he could manage, which was sideways and with his back turned. It was not enough. It was also not nothing. There is a particular kind of torment in knowing something needs to be said and being unable to find the courage to say it plainly. I had not thought about it charitably at the time. I thought about it charitably now. Margaret called 3 mornings after that. Your grandson made a transaction 2 months ago, she said when I answered. Significant. Come over. Her contact had located a transfer from Ethan's personal account, $1,200,000, routed through a series of intermediate accounts that had required patience to trace into a trust fund established in my name at a private banking institution in Savannah. The transfer had been made quietly, without announcement, without any documentation explaining its purpose. There was no record of Ethan having mentioned it to anyone. $1,200,000, the exact sum I had invested in Hargrove Legacy Fund 3 years ago. I sat across from Margaret and looked at the documents for a long time without speaking. She waited, which by now I understood was one of her particular strengths. That boy still has his father's heart, I said finally. He just lost his spine somewhere along the way. Margaret looked at me carefully. Does this change anything for you? I thought about it the way the question deserved. Ethan had tried to warn me. Ethan had quietly moved money to protect me. These were not the actions of a man entirely lost to what he had allowed to happen. They were the actions of a man caught between two things, choosing the version of doing right that required no confrontation and carried no personal cost, doing it at a distance, in the dark, in a way that would only matter if someone happened to look. It was not enough. It changes how I feel about him, I said. It doesn't change what I have to do. Margaret nodded once and refilled her tea and turned to the next page without further comment. That was the thing about working with a former federal judge. She understood that sentiment and strategy were two separate categories, and she did not allow one to contaminate the other. I spent 30 years in the military learning that the difference between winning and losing was rarely strength. It was almost always preparation. The side that wins is generally not the stronger side. It is the side that understood the terrain, positioned itself correctly, and made its critical decisions before the engagement began. By the time things were in motion, the outcome was mostly already determined. What followed was execution. That is how I approached the 2 months between learning what Madison Keller was planning and the night she intended to carry it out. The first thing I did was call James Morrison. I sat at Margaret's kitchen table on a Thursday morning and put the phone on speaker. And the three of us went through the Hargrove Legacy Fund documents line by line. Morrison had drafted that agreement himself, and he knew every clause with the precision of a man who had spent 40 years making sure language said exactly what he intended, and not one word more or less. The veto provision was intact. Morrison had drafted it with what he called belt and suspenders language, 2 independent protective layers, each sufficient on its own, meaning both would need to be dismantled before the provision could be removed. Madison's legal team had been working on the outer layer, apparently believing it was the only one. The inner layer had not been touched. They cannot remove the provision without your written authorization, Morrison said. Any restructuring that proceeds without your sign-off is voidable. If they file the Series B modification without your approval, I can have an injunction prepared within 48 hours and filed within the hour after that. They would be stopped before the ink was dry. I told him not to file anything yet. He paused. You want to let them proceed, I want to let them move, I said. There's a difference between those two things. Morrison was quiet for a moment. All right, he said finally. Your call. Margaret had been thinking about Robert Chen. She had come across his name through a retired colleague who had served on the board of a New York investment firm before moving into academia. Robert Chen was a managing partner at an institutional fund that had been looking for a Series B opportunity in the Southeast technology sector for the better part of a year. He was known for rigorous due diligence and for a particular aversion to situations that carried reputational or legal complications. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of investor that Madison's current arrangement would cause to walk away if he understood what he was walking into. Margaret made an introduction through her colleague. I spoke with Robert Chen by phone one Tuesday afternoon, briefly and carefully. I explained that I was the silent partner in Nexus Dynamics, that I had documented concerns about the proposed Series B structure currently being arranged, and that I believed a cleaner transaction was possible with a different capital structure if he was willing to be patient for a few more weeks. He asked 3 questions. I answered each one honestly. He said he would look into it and call me back. He called back 3 days later. He said what he had found was interesting and that he would attend the next Dynamics launch event in Atlanta as an observer. If the situation proved to be what I had described, he was prepared to discuss alternatives. I did not tell him which table I would be sitting at. The invitation arrived in the mail on a Monday, 2 weeks before the event. Heavy paper stock, gold lettering, the Four Seasons crest on the envelope. I set it on the kitchen counter and looked at it for a while. The reasonable move was to stay home. The expected move was to stay home. The old man who had been quietly edged out of his grandson's professional life simply doesn't appear at the event where his presence would be an inconvenience. Madison had almost certainly calculated on that. An absent obstacle requires no management. A present one is a different problem entirely, particularly if it has been paying attention. I called Morrison and confirmed my attendance. Then I called Margaret. "You're going to sit wherever they put you," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "And you're going to let her say what she's going to say?" "Yes." "And then I'll say what needs to be said." I told her. 6 words, possibly fewer. There was a brief silence on the line. "Make sure your suit is pressed," she said. In the 2 weeks before the event, I reviewed the documents a final time. I confirmed with Morrison that the injunction paperwork was ready and could be submitted within the hour on my instruction. I confirmed with Robert Chen's office that he would be present. I went over the Series A agreement until I could recite the critical provisions from memory, which I then verified I could. The morning of the event, I pressed the charcoal suit and polished my shoes. Before leaving the house, I opened the cedar box on my dresser and took out the bronze star. I pinned it carefully to my left lapel and looked at myself in the bathroom mirror for a moment. A good soldier never reveals his position until the moment it matters most. I had learned that lesson outside Da Nang in 1971, in circumstances considerably more consequential than a hotel ballroom in Atlanta. I drove north on Interstate 75 and arrived at the Four Seasons 15 minutes before the doors opened. I was ready. The young man at the ballroom entrance checked my invitation and directed me to table 14 near the kitchen service doors. And I thanked him and walked in without showing anything on my face. What I was thinking was that this was exactly where I needed to be. I want to explain what that means, because it matters to understanding what came next. Every decision I had made since the morning of the misdirected phone call had been built on one principle: do not reveal your position until the moment it is useful. Do not file the injunction until they move. Do not contact Robert Chen publicly until the plan requires it. Do not show Madison Keller, at any point before I was ready, that I understood what she was doing. On the night of the Four Seasons launch, that meant I had to arrive as expected, sit where I was put, and behave in every visible way like a man who was exactly what she believed me to be: an elderly inconvenience, present out of stubbornness, manageable with a firm public dismissal, Table 14 was the correct position for that performance. It was also the position with the clearest, unobstructed view of the entire room. I straightened my jacket, scanned the ballroom once, and found what I was looking for within 30 seconds. Robert Chen was seated at a table near the front, third chair from the left, wearing a dark suit and speaking to the woman beside him with the composed attentiveness of someone who had come not as a participant, but as an evaluator. He looked up briefly as I settled in. I gave him one small nod. He returned it and returned to his conversation. The room filled. The lights adjusted. Ethan was near the center of the room doing what he had always done in rooms full of people who needed to be impressed, making it look like something that required no effort at all. Then his eyes found mine. Earlier in this story, when I first described that eye contact, I said it felt like the moment someone he loved decided he wasn't worth acknowledging. That was accurate to what I experienced. But I understand it differently now. With everything I know, what I saw in Ethan's face in the half-second before he looked away was not indifference. It was fear. The specific fear of a man who has watched a situation move toward a point of no return and has not found a way to stop it. He knew I was there. He knew what I knew. He knew what was coming. And unlike me, he had not resolved his position before the evening began. He looked away because looking at me meant looking at the full consequence of what he had permitted, and he could not carry that weight in front of 200 people who were currently watching him succeed. I felt something adjacent to pity. I set it aside and kept watching. Madison stepped onto the stage. I had spent 2 months reading her private communications. Listening to her now was like hearing a document read aloud in its public translation while holding the original in your hands. Self-made man. Stated twice in the opening, for emphasis. The Hargrove Legacy Fund. The silent partner provision. The $1,200,000 that had funded the company's first 2 years, all of it absent. Not a lie, technically. An omission so precisely constructed that the truth had no natural occasion to emerge, without advantages, without connections, without a financial foundation that softened the hard years. Each phrase technically defensible. Not one of them acknowledging that the financial foundation which had made Nexus Dynamics possible had come from a man currently seated at a table by the kitchen door in a suit purchased at a department store sale. The courage to cut ties with anything that held him back. That phrase she held for a half-second longer than the others. A deliberate pause functioning as punctuation. I was the only person in the room who understood the specific referent, which made the pause feel very quiet, in a way that 200 people around me could not perceive. She was right that it landed. I felt it land precisely where it was aimed. I listened to every sentence she delivered and noted its construction with the detachment of someone who has had sufficient time to process his feelings separately from his analysis. She was skilled. The delivery was rehearsed without sounding it. If I hadn't spent 2 months reading her operational messages, I might have found parts of it genuinely affecting. Then she saw me begin to stand. She did not lose her place. She did not miss a beat. She pivoted with the smooth efficiency of someone who had anticipated exactly this contingency and written it into the evening's program, which she had. Because Madison's event coordinator had confirmed my RSVP 2 weeks prior. A man who shows up where he isn't expected needs to be managed publicly, firmly, and with maximum visible warmth. Oh, and I see that Jim is here with us tonight. The warmth was flawless. Ethan's grandfather, Jim. It might be more comfortable for you to wait in the lobby. These industry conversations can get quite technical, and we want to make sure everyone is at ease. 200 heads turned toward table 14. I finished standing. I adjusted the bronze star on my lapel. I looked across the room at Robert Chen, who had set down his water glass and was watching with the precise focus of a man who had just had a significant hypothesis confirmed. Then I pushed back my chair and began walking toward the stage. Not quickly, not angrily. With the measured pace of a man who made his decision well in advance and is simply arriving at the moment his preparation has been building towards. Behind me, I heard the room go quiet. The walk from table 14 to the front of the room was approximately 40 feet. I have made longer walks in more consequential circumstances. I have walked across open ground in Vietnam with fire coming in on my left flank. I have walked into rooms where men were waiting to deliver news that would alter everything. I have walked to the front of 2 churches to say goodbye to people I had built my life around. 40 feet of hotel carpeting, measured against any of those, was nothing, and yet those 40 feet felt significant in a way that had nothing to do with the distance. Every person in that room was watching. 200 people who had arrived expecting a celebration were now watching an old man in a charcoal suit walk slowly toward the stage, while the woman at the microphone maintained her composure with the practiced calm of someone executing a plan she had written and rehearsed. I did not hurry. I did not slow down. I walked at the pace of a man who knows precisely where he is going and has already decided what he will say when he gets there. I stopped a few feet from the stage and looked up at Madison Keller. She had held herself together throughout the walk. Her expression remained warm, her posture steady, the microphone at her side, her eyes tracking me with the controlled focus of someone who has anticipated this variable and prepared a response. She was going to handle it. She had a script for exactly this moment. She was ready. I said it clearly enough for the nearest tables to hear without effort. Check who the silent partner is. I watched the color leave her face. Not slowly. The way I had described it to myself afterward, a lamp switched off, immediate and complete. 6 words and the entire architecture of 18 months of planning became visible in the space between us. She understood what I had said. She understood that I understood what she had been doing. And she understood, in that fraction of a second, that the conversation she had prepared for was not the one she was now inside. Ethan was looking at the floor when I turned from the stage. I walked to the exit without looking back at him, without looking back at the stage, without looking back at 200 people who had just watched something they would be discussing for the rest of the evening. The lobby was cool and quiet. I pushed through the front doors and stood on the sidewalk in the Atlanta night air, and I breathed. Robert Chen came through the doors behind me less than a minute later. He stood beside me and looked out at the street in the companionable way of a man who understands that some things are said better sideways than directly. "I've spent 22 years in institutional investment," he said. "I've encountered that speech before. Different cities, different names, same underlying structure." He paused. "The silent partner, the presenting party, believes she can remove." "She knows better now," I said. He looked at me for a moment, with an expression that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same general territory. "Call me Monday morning," he said. "We'll structure this deal correctly, without the Kellers involved at any level or in any capacity." He extended his hand. I shook it. He went back inside. I walked to the parking structure and found my car. I want to be honest about what I felt in that parking lot, because I think the honest version is more useful than the version that sounds like a story with a clean ending. I did not feel victorious. I had prepared carefully, positioned myself correctly, said exactly what I had planned to say, and the thing I had built had worked as designed. But what I felt, sitting alone in that parking structure in the dark, was not the clean satisfaction of a completed operation. It was something quieter and less comfortable, the feeling that comes after a necessary procedure. When the thing is finished, and you are relieved, and you are also aware that what the recovery looks like is not yet fully visible. My phone began ringing at 9:47 in the evening. Ethan. Madison. Ethan. Two numbers I didn't recognize that would turn out to be attorneys from the Keller family firm. Ethan again. Madison a second time. Then a third unfamiliar number. Then 4 minutes of quiet. And then Ethan again. And again. I sat and watched each call arrive and pass, without touching the screen. When the 17th call ended, I turned the phone off, placed it in the glove compartment, and pulled out of the parking structure onto 14th Street. The drive back to Savannah is nearly 4 hours. I made it without the radio on, and without rehearsing conversations or imagining outcomes. I simply drove and let the highway provide what highways provide late at night, sufficient empty space for a man to locate the edges of what he is actually feeling. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had found them. What I felt was grief, not for myself, and not for what had been done to me. For Ethan. For the fact that the boy in the oversized suit at his father's grave had become a man who stood on a stage and studied his shoes while his grandfather was publicly dismissed, and had calculated in that moment that the cost of speaking was greater than he was willing to pay. I had no anger left for him. The anger had served its purpose and was now spent. What remained was something sadder and quieter and considerably more honest. I went inside. I sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a while. 3 days later, on a Thursday afternoon, I heard the front gate latch. I looked out the kitchen window. Ethan was walking up the path. He had come alone, and the fact that he had come without Madison told me more than anything he could have said in the first 10 minutes. The fact that he came without Madison told me more than anything he could have said in the first 10 minutes. I had been at the kitchen table reading when I heard the gate. I looked out the window and watched him walk up the path and recognized his gait before I could see his face clearly, the slightly forward lean Thomas had carried. The particular way both of them moved when they were carrying something heavy that wasn't physical. He was wearing a jacket over a shirt that was not pressed, which for Ethan was the equivalent of another man arriving in pieces. He looked like someone who had spent 3 days not sleeping and had run out of reasons to pretend otherwise. I opened the door before he could knock. He looked at me for a moment without speaking. I stepped back and let him in. We sat at the kitchen table, the same oak table where I had eaten breakfast alone for 8 years, where Ethan had done homework on Tuesday evenings when he was 12, where I had signed the Hargrove Legacy Fund documents with Morrison before driving home and making a sandwich I couldn't finish. I poured coffee for both of us. Neither of us touched it. I asked him first, because waiting for someone to find their way to the thing they came to say is a courtesy, but not always the efficient one. "How long have you known?" I said. He looked at his hands on the table. About Madison's plan, specifically about 4 months. I let that number sit in the room for a moment. 4 months. Before the engagement party I hadn't been invited to. Before the launch event invitations went out. 4 months during which he had driven to Savannah once and delivered a sentence with his back turned, and then driven home, and then said nothing for the remaining time. "And you said nothing," I said. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact, and I delivered it the same way. "No," he said. "I didn't." I stood up and went to the desk in the corner of the kitchen and came back with the blue folder I had kept there for 3 months. I set it on the table between us and sat down. "I want you to look at some things," I said. "Take your time." I had arranged the contents in the order that would make the fullest sense, not the most dramatic order, not the order designed to cause the most pain at any particular moment, but the order that told the story completely. The first document was the civil filing from Davidson County, Tennessee. Ethan looked at the name on the filing. He looked at the date. He looked at me. "Paul Garrett," I said. "Nashville. 4 years before you met her." He read through the filing slowly. I watched his face as he read, watched the particular quality of stillness that settles over a person who is reading something that confirms a fear they had been carrying and hoping was wrong. He read it to the end, set it down carefully, and looked at the table rather than at me. I took that document and placed the next one in front of him. There was one before Nashville," I said. "Charleston." The structure was slightly different, but the outcome was the same. She has done this at least twice that Margaret and I could document. I paused. Possibly more. Ethan stared at the second document without picking it up. Something in his expression had gone very still and careful. The way a person goes still when they understand that the ground they are standing on has changed character without warning. "She researched you before you met," I said. "She knew about the Hargrove Legacy Fund before your introduction was arranged. She knew about the silent partner provision. She identified it as an obstacle and built a plan to remove it. The marriage was the mechanism." I placed the third set of documents in front of him. The printed messages between Madison and D.K. He read them in silence. I watched him find the message that had stayed with me longest, Phase 1 complete. Estimated 18 months to Series B restructuring. Then we exit and watched him read it twice. Then he turned to the next page and read further. And I knew by the particular way his jaw tightened that he had found the line I had sent him there to find. The subject is emotionally dependent and highly manageable. He set the page down with a care that was almost excessive. The way a person handles something after they realize it is more fragile than it appeared, or perhaps more dangerous. He did not look at me. He looked at the far wall for a long moment. Then he said it. Not as a question, because by then there was no question left to ask. "She never loved me." I did not answer, because the answer was self-evident, and stating it would have added nothing to what he already understood. What he needed in that moment was not information, because he now had all of it. What he needed was a small amount of time to let the full weight of it settle from his head to somewhere deeper. The way a serious thing eventually must. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a car passed on the street and its sound faded, and the quiet resumed. Ethan looked at the documents on the table in front of him with the expression of a man who has spent 4 months knowing something abstractly and has just met it directly for the first time. He placed the last page carefully back onto the folder and folded his hands on the table. He did not speak. I did not speak. We sat in the kitchen of the house where I had raised him, in a silence that had more in it than most conversations. There are things a man has to say out loud, even when they cost him. Not because saying them changes anything that has already happened. Not because the person hearing them is guaranteed to understand in the way you intend. But because carrying them silently for too long damages something in the person who carries them. And there comes a point where the silence has done more harm than the saying ever would. I had been carrying certain things for some time. That afternoon, sitting across from Ethan at the kitchen table while the documents lay between us, I decided the time had passed for carrying them, I want to tell you some things, I said. Not to blame you for tonight, and not to make this harder than it already is. But you came here, and I think part of you came here to hear them, even if that isn't the word you would use for it. Ethan looked at me. He didn't speak. I sold the house near the coast to fund your company, I said. The property your grandmother and I had been planning to retire to when things slowed down. I cashed in the savings I had been building for 20 years. Every dollar I had set aside for the part of my life that was supposed to be quiet. I put it into the Hargrove Legacy Fund because you were Thomas's son, and Thomas never got the chance to build something that outlasted him. And I wanted you to have what he didn't get. I paused for a moment. Some things require a brief space between the saying and the continuing. I didn't tell you because I wanted you to be free to build it without the weight of knowing whose money was behind you. I didn't want you making cautious decisions because you were worried about what it would cost me if the company failed. I wanted you operating on your own judgment entirely. I still believe that was the right reasoning. I looked at him carefully. I am not asking you to feel guilty about any of it. I am telling you so you know the full picture. Ethan's hands were flat on the table. He was listening with the quality of attention that a person uses when they understand that what is being said matters, and they don't trust themselves to respond until all of it has been said. The Thanksgiving before last, I said. I drove 4 hours to Atlanta because you told me it was a small gathering. They put me at a folding table near the kitchen door with a woman I was never introduced to, and one of the catering staff who sat down by accident and then left when he realized his mistake. I sat there alone and ate turkey and listened to you laughing with people your wife had decided were worth the good china. I let that settle where it needed to settle. Then I drove 4 hours home in the dark and pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. I never told you that. Something moved across Ethan's face. He looked at the table. I am not telling you this to cause you pain, I said. I am telling you because you need to understand the actual price of what happened between us. Not my polished version of it. Not the version filtered through the 30 years I spent learning how to be useful and not difficult. The real price. The way a man needs to see the actual figures before he can understand what something genuinely cost. The kitchen was quiet. The evening light was going outside. I could hear the neighborhood settling into itself, a car on the next street. The sound a house makes when the temperature shifts. There is one more thing, I said. I told him about the day we buried Thomas. The rain. The shrapnel in my shoulder that always announces itself in wet weather. The feeling of standing at a second grave in 13 months and understanding that the people who made it worth standing up straight were gone. I told him about the promise I made that day, not out loud, not as formal language, but in the way of a man who commits to something in the silence of his own mind and holds himself to it without needing a witness. I told your father I would make sure his son knew what it meant to be a man who keeps his word. I said. Not that I would give you money or comfort or a path without difficulty, that I would show you what keeping your word looks like, even when it costs you, even when no one who matters is watching. I looked at him steadily. That was the promise. I want you to know I meant to keep it. I still do. I had said what needed saying. I stopped. Ethan sat with it for a long time. I watched something move through him slowly, the particular shift that happens when something abstract becomes specific and weighted. His eyes were bright in the way that doesn't necessarily mean tears, but lives in the same vicinity. He didn't look at me directly, and I didn't ask him to. After a while he said, "I know nothing I say tonight is enough." "No," I said, "but you're here. That counts for something." He nodded. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed something he had clearly been carrying for some time, a small USB drive. He set it on the table between us with the deliberate care of a man placing something that cost him something to place. 6 months of recordings, he said. Everything Madison said when she believed she was safe. I started after I understood what she was planning and couldn't find the courage to stop it any other way. He looked at me directly for the first time since sitting down. I kept telling myself there was still time to handle it differently. I picked up the USB drive and held it. "I know what that sounds like," he said. "I know what it sounds like too," I said. "I am going to listen to it anyway." I carried the USB to the old laptop I kept on the desk in the corner of the kitchen and plugged it in while I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee. I stood at the counter drinking it while the drive loaded, looking at nothing in particular, giving myself a moment before whatever was on that drive became something I could not unknow. Ethan sat at the kitchen table and said nothing. He had the stillness of a man who has set down the thing he came to set down and is now waiting to find out what it costs him. I sat at the desk and put the earphones in. The first file was dated 6 months ago. I pressed play. Madison's voice came through clearly, without background noise, which told me Ethan had been careful about the recording conditions. She was speaking to someone on the phone, her father, based on the cadence of her voice and the shorthand she used. She had the particular quality I had first noticed at the Italian restaurant in Buckhead, the quality I had struggled to name at the time, and had since identified precisely she was efficient. Every sentence moved toward a specific purpose and contained no word that didn't carry weight. She was describing the Series A restructuring timeline. She used the phrase legacy position twice in 60 seconds, each time the way a person refers to something that requires scheduling rather than consideration. She mentioned the launch event as a milestone. Then she said, in a tone that carried no more weight than a delivery date, that the position holder was elderly and in ordinary health, that actuarial probability suggested a natural resolution within a workable time frame if the legal restructuring encountered complications, and that either outcome served the plan equally well. Natural resolution. I listened to that phrase once. Then I removed the earphones, closed the laptop, and sat with my hands flat on the desk for a moment. She had accounted for my death as a fallback option, not with anger, not with anything resembling personal feeling. With the same flat practicality she brought to capital structures and filing deadlines. I was a line item. She had a contingency for each of the 2 ways a line item gets resolved. I stood up and brought my coffee back to the table and sat down across from Ethan. "How much of it have you listened to?" I asked. "All of it," he said. "More than once." "Then you know what it contains." "Yes," he said. "I know." We sat with that briefly. There was nothing useful to add to it. "Here is what is going to happen," I said. I kept my voice level, because this was not a moment that benefited from anything other than precision. The Series B restructuring that Madison's team has been preparing will not go through. The veto right I hold under the Series A agreement is intact, and I intend to exercise it. I have been in contact with an alternative institutional investor named Robert Chen, who was present at the launch event Thursday evening. He has agreed to structure a legitimate Series B without the Keller family's firm involved at any stage or in any capacity. Ethan was watching me carefully. "The company you built is sound," I said. "What was being done to it was not your creation, and it does not have to define what Nexus Dynamics becomes. But that will require you to make some decisions clearly, with counsel of your own choosing, not anyone with any connection to Madison or her father." "I understand," he said. "Read the Series A documents yourself," I said. "The full text, not a summary from someone else's lawyer. You will find things in there that clarify your position considerably." I paused. "Make the right decision. I will know if you did." He nodded once. The kitchen had gone fully dark outside. I had not turned on the overhead light, and the lamp on the counter cast a narrow warmth across the table between us. We had been sitting here for the better part of the evening, and I could feel the weight of everything that had been said settling into the room, the way heavy things settle slowly, completely, without the option of being retrieved. "What about us?" Ethan said. It was the question I had known was coming since he sat down. He had been holding it for hours, placing it aside each time a more specific conversation required his attention. And now the specific things were finished, and the larger question was all that remained. "Go home," I said. "Handle the legal matters with your own counsel. Make the decisions that need to be made because they are right, not because of what you think I expect." I looked at him steadily. "After that, you will need to decide what kind of man you are going to be. Not for me, for yourself, and for Thomas. And after I decide," he said quietly, "what happens with us?" I looked at him across the table for a long moment. The boy in the oversized suit, the man who had carried a USB drive in his jacket pocket to his grandfather's house because it was the only form of courage he had been able to manage. It was not the courage I would have chosen for him, but it was real, and it had cost him something, and I did not discount it. "That is up to you," I said. "It always was." He held my eyes for a moment. Then he stood, put on his jacket, and picked up his keys from the table. He walked to the front door and paused at the threshold for a moment with his back to me. He did not say anything. I did not need him to. The door opened and closed. His footsteps crossed the porch. His car started in the street and drove away. I sat alone in the kitchen in the lamplight. Some silences need time. I had learned that a long time ago, and I was willing to give this one whatever it required. Robert Chen was exactly the kind of man Madison had been counting on not to exist. She had built the entire Series B approach around a simple assumption that the silent partner in the Hargrove Legacy Fund was an elderly retired man who understood nothing about institutional finance, who could be embarrassed into compliance or quietly maneuvered into irrelevance before he understood what was being done to him, and who had no meaningful connections to the kind of capital that could disrupt her timeline. She had been thorough in her research. She had simply researched the wrong version of me. I called Robert Chen at 9 o'clock Monday morning from my kitchen in Savannah. The conversation was shorter than I expected. He had spent the weekend having his team review the Series A documents, confirm the veto provision language, and outline what a clean Series B structure would require with his firm as lead investor. When I called, he was ready. I called Morrison immediately after and authorized the veto filing. Morrison had the paperwork submitted before noon. Madison's legal team received official notification that the restructuring proposal was void, that any proceeding toward a Series B would require consent from the Hargrove Legacy Fund, and that consent would not be forthcoming under the existing terms or any terms that included the Keller family's involvement. Morrison told me later that the response from Madison's counsel had been brief and contained no meaningful objection. When a plan depends entirely on a target remaining unaware of what is being done to him, the plan has very little architecture to fall back on once the target demonstrates that he has been aware for some time. The Series B closed 3 weeks later with Robert Chen's firm as lead investor. The terms were standard, the capital structure was clean, and the Keller family was involved in no part of it at any level. Nexus Dynamics would continue. Whatever Ethan chose to build from here was his to decide. I found out about Madison's divorce filing through Morrison, who had a contact at the Fulton County Courthouse. She filed exactly 1 week after the launch event, citing irreconcilable differences and incompatibility of long-term goals. The language was the legal translation of a plan that had failed and an exit that had been drafted in advance and needed only a date entered. Given what I knew about how Madison Keller operated, that was almost certainly accurate in a more literal sense than the filing was intended to convey. Douglas Keller's firm withdrew from all involvement with Nexus Dynamics within 48 hours of receiving Morrison's veto notification. No statement, no explanation, no counteroffer. They simply removed themselves from every correspondence channel associated with the company, with the practiced efficiency of people who understood how to minimize exposure when a situation was no longer advantageous. The speed of that withdrawal confirmed what Margaret and I had believed since the early weeks of the investigation. Douglas had known what his daughter was doing and had provided the infrastructure for it. When the plan collapsed, he moved like a man who had planned his exit alongside hers. I told Margaret all of this over coffee at her kitchen table the week after the Series B closed. She listened in her usual way, which was with the full and undivided attention of someone who spent 25 years on a federal bench, learning that the quality of what you hear depends entirely on the quality of the silence you bring to the hearing. When I finished, she refilled her tea and looked at me. "Are you relieved?" she asked. I thought about it, which her questions generally required. For Ethan, yes, I said. The company is intact. The structure is legitimate. What happens with it now depends on the decisions he makes, which is how it should have been from the beginning. That relieves me. I paused. For myself, I stopped needing relief the night I walked out of that ballroom. What I feel now is mostly the particular tiredness that comes when a long thing is finally finished. Margaret nodded. She looked out her kitchen window at the sunflowers along the fence, which had gone to seed in October and stood bare-stalked and tall in the thin morning light. "You did what you set out to do," she said. "Yes. And the rest is waiting." Yes, what I had set out to do had been finite and specific. Protect the investment, exercise the veto, establish a clean path forward for the company, and ensure that the people who had treated my existence as a scheduling problem understood clearly that the scheduling problem had been paying careful attention throughout. Those things were done. What I could not accomplish through legal strategy or careful preparation was determining what Ethan would choose to become on the other side of everything that had happened. That had always been outside the scope of what I could control, and I had made my peace with that. Margaret showed me a brief item in the Atlanta business section describing the Nexus Dynamics Series B closing. 3 paragraphs. My name appeared nowhere in it, which was precisely as it should be. I drank my coffee. She drank her tea. Outside, the morning continued in the particular way that mornings continue after large things have settled quietly, without ceremony, without any acknowledgement of what has just passed through. "What will you do now?" Margaret asked. I thought about the fence Ethan and I had built the summer he was 14. Which had needed paint for 2 years, and which I had been walking past every morning without stopping. "I'm going to paint the fence," I said. Margaret looked at me. "That's it. That is enough for today." She made the small sound that was the closest she came to laughing. We finished our coffee and I walked home. What I had not expected was what came next from Ethan. Margaret called me at 7 in the morning. She only called that early when something was important. I walked down the street in the October cold, with my coffee still in hand, and she met me at the door the way she always did, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. Something in her hand indicating she had been in the middle of work before I arrived. We sat at her kitchen table and she slid the printed pages across without preamble. Ethan had read the Series A agreement, the full document, not a summary prepared by someone else. He had retained independent counsel, a corporate attorney in Atlanta with no connection to Madison or to Douglas Keller, and had cooperated fully and without reservation with Robert Chen's firm throughout the remainder of the Series B process. Every document Morrison requested had been provided promptly and completely. Every question put to him had been answered directly. There had been no attempt to negotiate terms that benefited him at the company's expense. No effort to preserve any element of Madison's original restructuring proposal, and no condition placed on his cooperation. He had done what needed to be done without being asked twice and without extracting anything in return. He had made the right decision. I read the report twice, set it down on the table. "There is one more thing," Margaret said. She turned to the final page and pointed to a paragraph near the bottom, a brief notation from Morrison confirming that the trust fund transfer made 2 months before the Four Seasons event remained intact and untouched. $1,200,000 in my name, exactly where it had been placed. I looked at that paragraph for a while without speaking. Ethan had cooperated fully when it mattered. He had also, 2 months before any consequences were visible, moved his own money quietly to protect someone he had not protected in any visible way when it might have counted. Both of those things were true at the same time. I had learned that most honest assessments of people work that way, composed of parts that don't fully resolve against each other, requiring a person to hold contradictions without needing to choose between them. "He still has his father's heart," I said. Margaret looked at me. "Is that enough?" "I don't know yet," I said. "But it is something real." We finished our coffee and I walked home. The 6 months that followed were the quietest I had known since before Carol got sick. I painted the fence that Ethan and I had built together the summer he was 14. I worked from the far end toward the house, 1 section per morning in the thin November light, taking my time with the corners and the grain the way my father had taught me when I was young, and believed that most things worth doing deserved the proper amount of attention. I remembered clearly the Saturday Ethan and I had spent putting that fence up. He had complained about the work for the first 2 hours, with the particular theatrical resignation of a teenage boy. And then something had shifted in the afternoon, and he had worked steadily and well until we finished. And at the end of the day, he had stood back and looked at it with the quiet pride of someone who doesn't want to admit that a thing they complained about turned out to be exactly what they needed. I painted slowly and let myself remember it without rushing toward anything else. I drank my coffee on the back porch in the mornings before the day required anything particular of me. The mockingbird in the oak tree became something like a fixture of those mornings. I gave him a name, which is not the same as knowing him, but serves a similar function. I worked through the rest of the cookbook I had bought the first year I was raising Ethan, the one I had started and never finished, making my way through the remaining recipes with no urgency and no audience other than myself. Margaret and I had coffee 2 or 3 mornings a week as the months settled into routine. Our conversations ranged further from the practical as the legal work receded. She told me about the cases from her years on the bench that had stayed with her longest, both the ones she was proud of and the 1 or 2 she was not. And I told her about the postings that had been worth the trouble and the ones that hadn't. Sometimes we talked about nothing of consequence for the simple pleasure of having someone on the other side of the table who wasn't managing anything or requiring anything in return. I had not understood until that autumn how much of my recent life had been conducted in a silence that was not chosen, but only accumulated through circumstance. The distinction between chosen quiet and accumulated silence is considerable. I was grateful to understand it. In the evenings after dinner, I wrote at the desk in the corner of the kitchen. Notes for myself, not for any audience, about Carol, about Thomas, about the things I had understood too late and the few things I had gotten right, about what I would say if the saying were still possible, about the particular quality of the late afternoon light in that kitchen, which was the same light I remembered from the evenings Ethan had done his homework at this table at age 10, and the same light from 30 years before that, when it had been only Carol and me, and the whole thing was still ahead of us. Writing does not change what happened, but it gives things a place to exist outside the place inside you where they have been sitting without acknowledgement. I found that useful. One evening in early October, nearly a year after the night at the Four Seasons, I opened the bottom drawer of the desk to look for something and found the envelope near the back, under papers I had not sorted in years. Thomas was written on the front in my own handwriting from a long time ago. I sat with it in my hands for a long moment. Outside, the last light was leaving the yard. The letter was written on paper that had yellowed slightly at the edges, the kind that does not survive years particularly well, but had managed to survive these ones. My own handwriting, from a different period of my life, when the hand that held the pen moved differently because it carried a different weight than it does now. I sat at the desk for a moment before opening the envelope, the way a person sits before doing something that cannot be reversed. Then I opened it. One page. I had written it the week after Thomas's funeral, at this same desk, at some hour of the night when sleep had become unavailable, and I needed to do something that did not require me to be capable of speaking. I had not known at the time whether I intended to keep it. I had kept it for 15 years without making a decision to do so, which is sometimes how the important things survive, not through intention, but through the accumulated weight of not being thrown away. I had written to Thomas the way a man writes when he is not certain anyone is listening, but feels he must try regardless. I told him I did not know how to do what I was about to attempt. I told him I had spent 30 years in the Army learning to manage large problems with limited resources, and that a 7-year-old boy who had just lost both his parents occupied a different category of difficulty than anything I had been trained for. I told him the boy had Carol's eyes, which was something I had not been prepared for, and that every time I looked at him, I saw things that helped, and things that made the helping harder. I told him I would do my best by that standard, and hold myself to it, regardless of whether anyone was watching. And then, near the bottom of the page, I had written the line I had spoken aloud to Ethan in this kitchen 2 months ago. I promise I will make sure your son knows what it means to be a man who keeps his word. I read that sentence twice. Then I set the letter carefully on the desk and looked at the watch on my left wrist. Thomas had bought it the year he turned 25, with the first significant paycheck from the job he had been building towards since high school. A simple watch, well made. The kind that does not call attention to itself, but keeps accurate time for decades without requiring much. He was wearing it the morning of the accident on Interstate 95. I had been given it at the hospital along with his other personal effects, and I had put it on my wrist that same evening and had not removed it since. 15 years. Through more mornings and evenings and unremarkable days than I had kept count of, I slid it off and held it in my palm. It was lighter than I expected, which struck me as strange given how thoroughly I had become aware of its weight over 15 years. I turned it over. The back was plain, uninscribed. Thomas had bought it for practical reasons, not sentimental ones, and had never seen the need to add sentiment to something that was already doing its job. That was exactly like him. I carried it to the bedroom and placed it in the cedar box on the dresser beside the bronze star, then stood for a moment in the quiet of the house. I knew Ethan would call. Not when, but I had understood since the kitchen table conversation that there was something between us that required one more visit to complete something that could not be handled by phone or letter, that needed the specific gravity of presence. He called on a Saturday morning in October while I was reading the paper. "Jim," he said, "I'm in Savannah. Can I come by?" "Yes," I said. He arrived 20 minutes later. I heard the gate and came around the side of the house to meet him on the path. He was wearing a jacket that fit him correctly. He looked like a man who had made decisions that needed making and had found some measure of ground on the other side of them, not healed exactly, but located. Standing somewhere specific instead of between things. He stopped at the front walk and looked at the fence. "You repainted it," he said. "It needed it," I said. He looked at it for another moment, and I could see him placing it, recognizing it as the fence we had built the summer he was 14, and now seeing the fresh paint and understanding something about the time I had spent on it. He didn't comment further, which was the right instinct. "Come to the door," I said. He waited on the porch while I went inside to the bedroom. I took the cedar box from the dresser and carried it back to the front door. The October light was the particular clear gold of a coastal Georgia morning when the season is just turning, and it lay across the porch boards in long, level stripes. I held the box out to him. He looked at it, then at me. "Your father wanted you to have this when you were ready," I said. "I just had to wait until you were." He took it with both hands. He opened it slowly. He looked at the watch for a long time without picking it up, without saying anything, without moving. I watched his face and recognized what was moving through it, the particular expression of someone receiving something they did not know they had been waiting to receive. I nodded once and went back inside and closed the door. Some moments carry enough weight without adding to them. I went to the kitchen window and looked out at the porch. Ethan was standing exactly where I had left him, holding the cedar box in both hands, looking at the watch. The October light fell across him and across the freshly painted fence behind him and across the yard that had been his yard when he was young. He did not move for a long time. I did not go back out. I made coffee instead, and let him have the porch and the morning and the watch and whatever he needed to do with all of it in his own time. I turned 77 last month. Margaret made a cake. It was genuinely terrible. She is exceptional at a great many things, and baking is not among them, which she is fully aware of and which did not prevent her from baking. I ate 2 pieces. She looked appropriately pleased with herself. I am telling you this because I want you to understand what my life looks like now, a little more than a year after the night at the Four Seasons. It looks like terrible cake eaten willingly. It looks like coffee on the back porch before the day requires anything of me. It looks like a painted fence and a mockingbird in an oak tree, and the quiet of a house where a person lives because he has chosen to live there, rather than because he has not yet worked out how to leave. It looks like enough. I have spent time since that October morning thinking about what I would say if I were going to say something useful, not about the legal details or the specific events, but about the thing underneath all of it that actually mattered. I have decided there is one thing worth saying, and I am going to say it plainly. Jim's story is not about revenge. It is not about money or legal strategy or winning. It is about something every man who has ever been quietly dismissed, managed, or made to feel like an inconvenience will recognize at a level below words. Most of the men I know who are my age, men who served, men who worked with their hands for decades, men who spent 30 or 40 years building something for a family or a company or a community, most of those men share a particular blind spot. They understand very clearly what it means to be useful. They have spent their entire adult lives developing and demonstrating that capacity. What they have not spent nearly enough time on is the question of what they are worth when the usefulness is not immediately visible to the people around them. I was one of those men for a long time. I spent years raising my grandson, funding his company, and driving 4 hours every month to deliver groceries and fold cash into envelopes. And in none of those years did I stop to examine whether the people I was doing those things for were treating me as though I had value beyond what I could provide. I told myself that was selflessness. I was wrong. It was a form of avoidance. If I never asked the question, I never had to sit with the answer. The people who take advantage of men like me, and there are people who understand exactly how to do this. They do not succeed because we are foolish. They succeed because we have been trained since we were young to equate our value with our output. To believe, somewhere below the level of examination, that a man who stops producing stops deserving. To accept quietly and without complaint whatever space we are assigned in the lives of the people we have spent our lives helping build. I had been assigning myself table 14 for years before anyone else thought to do it. And I had been calling it humility. There comes a moment, if you are still paying attention, when you realize the people around you have already decided what you are worth. They have filed their assessment and moved forward accordingly. And you have a choice. You can accept that number and spend whatever time remains fitting inside it. Or you can decide, clearly and without drama, that your worth was never theirs to determine. What I understand now, sitting in my kitchen in Savannah with the painted fence outside and the cedar box on the bedroom dresser, and the peace that comes from finally telling the truth about what things cost. What I understand now is that there is a meaningful difference between being humble and being invisible, between not needing to be at the center of things and accepting that you have no legitimate place in them at all, between a man who gives without keeping score and a man who gives without noticing that no one else is keeping score either. You are allowed to know what you are worth, not in the sense of demanding recognition or presenting the accumulated ledger of your sacrifices as a bill for payment. I mean something quieter and more fundamental, the simple refusal to accept, as a settled fact, that the people who matter most to you are entitled to your presence when it serves them and free to discard it when it doesn't. The decision to treat your own dignity as a fixed point, not because you are important in any large sense, but because you are a person. And persons are non-negotiable by definition, and no one gets to revoke that without your consent. I learned that too late and just in time. Both of those things are true simultaneously. God puts certain men on this earth to hold things together, to be the ones who stay when others leave, who build without asking for credit, who sacrifice in silence and call it nothing. God sees every mile driven, every dollar given without ceremony, every evening spent alone in a kitchen that used to hold more people than it does now. And God has a way of settling what the world leaves unsettled in His own time, through means that no scheme can anticipate and no legal strategy can replicate. Thomas's watch is where it belongs. Some promises, kept faithfully enough, find their way home. If you are 60 years old, or 65, or 77, and you have been sitting at your own version of Table 14 for longer than you can comfortably account for, I am not going to tell you what to do. I am going to tell you that you are not alone in having arrived here, that it does not mean you failed, and that the fact that you are still paying attention is the only qualification required for deciding to change direction. My name is James Hargrove. Most people call me Jim. I am a retired Army colonel, a widower, and a grandfather who spent years raising a boy and nearly lost himself in the effort. I live in Savannah, Georgia. I drink my coffee on the back porch. I painted my fence last November and took my time with it. And I am glad I did. If any part of this story was worth your time, leave a comment below and tell me where you are watching from. And tell me about the man in your life who has been Jim, the one who showed up quietly, who built everything worth having, who never sat at the right table but made sure everyone else had a seat. He deserves to know you see him. Send this to him today. No explanation needed. He will know what it means.